Have you ever walked outside your home one morning and realized strangers had already decided your property belonged to them? Not asked, not negotiated, not discussed, just decided. Because that's exactly how this nightmare started for me. And I'll be honest with you, when it first happened, I truly believed it had to be some kind of misunderstanding. There was no way anybody could be arrogant enough to pave over a private family road in broad daylight. No way somebody could just arrive with bulldozers, construction crews, and asphalt trucks and start tearing apart land that didn't belong to them. At least, that's what I thought. Turns out, I was wrong. Very wrong. I live just outside a small growing town where farmland is slowly disappearing every single year. The kind of place where everybody used to know each other. Where people waved from pickup trucks. Where families owned the same land for generations. But over the years, things started changing. Developers came in. Money came in. Luxury neighborhoods started replacing open fields. And suddenly people who had never touched dirt in their lives started acting like they owned the countryside. But before all of that, before the lawsuits, before the bulldozers, before the HOA nightmare, there was just our farm. Simple, quiet, honest. My family has owned that land since 1902. Not rented, not leased, owned. My great-grandfather bought the property after working railroad construction jobs for nearly 15 years. According to family stories, he kept money hidden inside his boots because banks back then weren't trusted out in rural areas. He worked through winters so cold his hands cracked open. Worked summers hot enough to make railroad steel burn your skin. And eventually he saved enough money to buy the land outright. Back then the property was mostly wilderness. Trees, rocky ground, creek beds, wild grass, no roads, no barns, no fences. Everything my family built after that came from sweat and sacrifice. That's why the farm mattered so much to us. It wasn't inherited wealth. It wasn't luxury property. It was earned. Every fence post had a story behind it. Every shed, every gate, every inch of gravel. Even the farmhouse itself had been expanded room by room over generations. My grandfather used to point at different walls and say things like, "Your father built that section after the flood of '62. Or, "That beam came from the old red barn before the tornado." The farm carried history everywhere you looked. And the most important piece of the property was the road. The old Carter family farm road. Now to most people, it probably looked ordinary. Just gravel and packed dirt stretching from the county highway through the middle of our land toward the south fields. But to us, that road was everything. It was the main access route for tractors, livestock trailers, feed deliveries, hay equipment, and emergency vehicles for over 100 years. Without that road, large portions of the property became almost impossible to access properly. My father maintained it constantly. Every spring, he'd spread fresh gravel. Every winter, he'd clear branches after storms. Every summer, he'd repair washouts after heavy rain. And no matter how tired he was, he always handled that road personally. I remember asking him once why he cared so much about a simple dirt road. He looked at me seriously and said, "If that road ever disappears, this farm disappears with it." At the time, I thought he was exaggerating. Turns out, he understood something I didn't. Because roads mean power. Access means control. And the moment somebody controls access to your land, they start controlling your future. Now for most of my life, our farm sat quietly outside town while the world slowly changed around us. First, the small grocery store became a shopping plaza. Then old ranchland turned into housing developments. Then chain restaurants arrived. Then came the luxury communities. Huge gated neighborhoods with fountains at the entrance and fake stone walls designed to look rustic. The kind of places where every house looks exactly the same except for the mailbox design. Honestly, most of us locals laughed about them at first. Because nobody from around here could actually afford those homes. They were built for wealthy people moving out from the city looking for country living, without actually wanting country life. Still, none of that really affected us. At least, not directly. Or so I thought. About 6 months before everything exploded, I started hearing construction farther out near the wooded hills behind my south pasture. At first, I ignored it. Construction had become normal around town. But slowly, the noise got worse. Bulldozers, excavators, concrete trucks, dump trucks rumbling at sunrise. Sometimes it sounded like an entire highway project was happening behind the trees. One afternoon, I drove toward the creek to check fencing after a storm. And that's when I first saw it. A massive sign planted beside. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not even for a minute. Every single time I closed my eyes, I saw those machines tearing apart the Carter Farm Road. I kept hearing the sound of asphalt rollers crushing gravel my father laid down with his own hands. That sound stayed stuck in my head like a nightmare replaying over and over again. And honestly, the worst part wasn't even the construction itself. It was the attitude behind it. The arrogance. The disrespect. Nobody knocked on my door. Nobody asked permission. Nobody apologized. The HOA and developers acted like my family's property was just some inconvenient obstacle standing in the way of their luxury neighborhood project. And I think that's what hurt the most. To them, the farm meant nothing. Just land. Just dirt. Just empty space they could reshape however they wanted. But to me, that road carried generations of memories. I learned how to drive on that road, sitting beside my dad in his old faded pickup truck. I learned how to repair fences on that road. I learned how to haul hay, guide cattle, and survive storms on that road. I remember helping my grandfather shovel mud after heavy floods washed parts of it away. I remember icy winter mornings chasing escaped cattle through snow while my dad laughed at me for slipping in frozen puddles. I remember my mother standing beside the mailbox at the end of that road, waiting for me to come home from school. That road wasn't gravel. It wasn't dirt. It was history. Family history. And now, strangers were paving over it like none of that mattered. Around midnight, I finally gave up trying to sleep. I got out of bed, pulled on my boots, grabbed a flashlight, and walked upstairs into the farmhouse attic. Now our attic wasn't clean or organized like modern houses. It was decades of family history packed into one dusty space. Old trunks, broken furniture, boxes stacked on top of boxes. The air smelled like dust, dry wood, and old paper. And honestly, standing up there felt strange that night. Almost heavy. Like the house itself knew something bad was happening. My grandfather saved everything. And I mean everything. Tax receipts, maps, handwritten notes, old family photographs, farm equipment manuals from the 1940s, newspapers from World War II, even rusted tools nobody had touched in decades. As a kid, I used to love exploring that attic. My grandfather would tell stories about almost every item up there. Sometimes he'd spend an hour talking about a single old photograph. Back then I thought he was just sentimental. Now I realize he was protecting history. I searched for hours that night, opening boxes, sorting papers, digging through piles of documents. At one point, I found an old photo of my father standing beside the farm road in the 1970s holding a shovel after a storm washed part of it out. That almost broke me, because suddenly I realized something painful. The road had outlived almost everybody who built it. My great-grandfather, gone. My grandfather, gone. My father, gone. And now strangers were destroying the one thing they all fought to protect. I sat there staring at that photo for a long time. Angry, frustrated, honestly, a little helpless too. Because deep down I knew fighting developers and HOAs wasn't easy. Those people had money, lawyers, political connections. Meanwhile, I was just one farmer trying to stop a luxury development. Eventually I almost gave up searching. I remember sitting back against a wooden beam, exhausted. Then I noticed something strange behind an old dresser shoved against the wall. A small wooden trunk, covered in dust. I honestly don't think I'd seen it in years. The lock had rusted almost completely shut. I dragged it forward and forced it open carefully. Inside were old wrapped bundles tied together with faded cloth strips. Family documents mostly. But sitting right on top was an envelope with my grandfather's handwriting. The second I saw it, my stomach tightened, because I recognized his handwriting immediately. Sharp, neat, almost carved into the paper. The envelope said, "To the next Carter responsible for this land." I swear my hands actually shook opening it. Inside was a short handwritten letter, and one sentence hit me harder than anything else. Developers always come eventually. I just stared at those words. Because somehow, my grandfather saw this coming decades ago. He knew one day somebody would try taking advantage of the property. The letter explained that the South Road crossing the farm was the single most important piece of land on the property. Apparently, there had been legal disputes long before I was born. Neighboring ranchers, county access discussions, expansion proposals. According to the letter, my great-grandfather fought multiple battles to protect that road after buying the land in 1902. That's why special legal protections were added to the property deed. Then I found it, folded carefully beneath the letter. The original deed itself. The real one. Old parchment paper. County seals. Official signatures. Some sections were faded with age, but most of it remained perfectly readable. I carefully unfolded it on the attic floor beneath the flashlight. And there it was, clear as day. The Carter family permanently owned the entire southern access corridor under protected agricultural designation. But then I noticed something even bigger. A clause near the bottom. One sentence. One single sentence that changed everything. No neighboring authority, commercial developer, or adjacent landowner may alter, pave, modify, expand, or repurpose the protected roadway without written authorization from the Carter family. I read it again, then one more time just to make sure I wasn't imagining it. Because if that document was still legally valid, the HOA hadn't just made a mistake. They had made a catastrophic mistake. A massive mistake. The kind of mistake that destroys projects. The kind of mistake that costs millions. And suddenly, for the first time since the construction started, I felt something I hadn't felt in days. Hope. Real hope. The next morning, I drove straight into town before sunrise to visit Walter Briggs. Now Walter wasn't some fancy television lawyer. No giant office. No expensive suits. No flashy advertisements. His office sat above an old hardware store downtown. Tiny waiting room. Old furniture. Stacks of papers everywhere. But around here, Walter Briggs was legendary. Farmers trusted him because he actually understood rural property law. And more importantly, he respected land ownership. I walked into his office carrying the deed inside an old folder. Walter barely looked up at first. "Morning," he muttered while reading paperwork. I handed him the document without saying much. At first he looked almost bored. Then he unfolded the deed. And everything changed. I watched his expression shift immediately. His eyes narrowed. He adjusted his glasses. Then he slowly read the page again. And again. Finally he looked up at me and asked, "Where did you get this?" My grandfather kept it hidden. Walter leaned back in his chair, completely stunned. "Do you understand what this is?" I shook my head. "I'm hoping you'll explain it." Walter actually laughed. Not because it was funny. Because he couldn't believe what he was seeing. These idiots paved protected agricultural access land. Then he pointed directly at the clause. "Do you realize how rare protections like this are?" Apparently older agricultural deeds sometimes contain special protections modern developers overlook, especially when the land stays within one family continuously for generations. Walter explained that many development companies rush projects assuming older rural properties lack updated documentation. But this was ironclad. Then Walter looked directly at me and said, "If this document survives court review." He paused. "They're in serious trouble." I asked how serious. Walter smiled slowly. "The entrance alone probably cost several $1,000,000. That shocked me. But then he explained something even bigger. The entire Cedar Ridge Estates development had apparently been designed around my road. The luxury entrance, traffic flow, emergency access routes, marketing materials. Everything depended on that direct access point. Without my road, the neighborhood design changed completely. Traffic would need rerouting. Permits might need rewriting. Emergency vehicle access could fail inspection. Property values could drop, meaning the HOA didn't just risk losing pavement. They risked collapsing the entire project. And honestly, that was the first moment I truly realized the developers were vulnerable. Up until then, they acted untouchable, like powerful people always do. But suddenly, they had a problem money alone. By the time the court date finally arrived, the entire county was talking about the Cedar Ridge disaster. And I mean everybody, Farmers talked about it at gas stations while drinking coffee before sunrise. Cashiers talked about it in grocery store checkout lines. Construction workers talked about it during lunch breaks. Even local news stations started covering the story every night. Because people love watching arrogant developers get exposed, especially in small towns. And honestly, the HOA deserved every second of embarrassment coming their way. For months, those people acted untouchable. They bulldozed private property, ignored legal warnings, threatened lawsuits, treated my family like we were standing in the way of their progress. But now the whole town was watching them panic. And the closer court got, the more nervous Cedar Ridge estates became. You could feel it everywhere. Construction around the development slowed dramatically. Workers stood around more than they worked. Some houses sat unfinished for weeks. Equipment disappeared. Rumors spread constantly. People started whispering that investors were getting scared. Others claimed homeowners were threatening lawsuits. Some said banks were reconsidering financing. At first, I ignored most of the rumors. Small towns exaggerate everything. But one thing became very clear. Cedar Ridge Estates was in trouble. Real trouble. A few days before court, I drove past the entrance accidentally while heading into town. And honestly, seeing it made me angry all over again. The giant stone walls, the expensive landscaping, the decorative lights, all of it built directly through land my family protected for generations. It looked polished, wealthy, perfect, but underneath all that luxury, it was still stolen property. And soon everybody would know it. The morning of the first court hearing, I woke up before sunrise. Couldn't sleep. Could barely eat. I sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window toward the farm road while drinking coffee. The same road my father spent years protecting. The same road my grandfather warned me about. And for the first time since this entire nightmare started, I felt nervous. Not scared exactly, but heavy. Because this wasn't just about land anymore. This was about legacy. If we lost, part of my family's history disappeared forever. Walter Briggs arrived at the farmhouse around 7 that morning. He stepped out carrying 2 thick legal folders and the original deed protected inside a hard case. Walter looked calm as always. That man could probably walk through a tornado without changing facial expressions. He simply nodded at me and said, "You ready?" Honestly, no. But I said yes anyway. The courthouse parking lot was already packed when we arrived. News vans, residents, developers, HOA board members, even random people from town showed up just to watch. That's how big the story had become. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere felt tense immediately. The HOA side filled almost 2 entire rows. Expensive suits everywhere. Polished shoes. Luxury watches. People whispering constantly. Developers sat together looking stressed. Some homeowners from Cedar Ridge Estates attended too. Most looked confused more than angry. And honestly, I almost felt bad for some of them. Because many probably had no idea the neighborhood entrance might have been illegally built. They bought expensive homes, believing everything was legitimate. Meanwhile, the HOA leadership knew there were ownership concerns long before construction began. That's what made the situation disgusting. Then Richard Holloway entered the courtroom. And for the first time since I met him, he didn't look confident. Gone was the smug smile. Gone was the polished attitude. He looked exhausted. Dark circles under his eyes. Tense posture. Constantly whispering with attorneys. The pressure was clearly crushing him. And honestly, good. Because for months, he treated my family like we were irrelevant. Now he finally understood consequences. The hearing started, and immediately the HOA lawyers tried controlling the narrative. That's what expensive attorneys do. They try shaping perception before facts fully emerge. Their lead attorney stood confidently and argued that the Carter Farm Road had become functionally public over time. He claimed the surrounding region benefited from the development. He described Cedar Ridge Estates as an economic improvement for the county. Then he made a mistake. A big mistake. He suggested my family had failed to modernize the property for evolving community needs. The moment he said that, I saw the judge's expression change. Because property rights don't disappear just because wealthy developers dislike old farms. And judges especially hate when people act entitled toward private land ownership. Then Walter Briggs stood up, calm, quiet, patient, and absolutely destroyed them. Walter didn't raise his voice, didn't act dramatic. He simply presented facts one after another like a man slowly building a wall. He started with history. The Carter family ownership dating back to 1902. Continuous property taxes paid for generations. Maintenance records. Agricultural registrations. Survey maps. Photographs. Witness statements. Even handwritten records from my grandfather documenting repairs along the road. Then Walter introduced the original deed. The entire courtroom became silent. Even the HOA attorneys leaned forward. Walter carefully explained every section. The protected agricultural designation. The permanent ownership corridor. The restrictions against unauthorized modification. And then, the clause. The clause that changed everything. No neighboring authority, commercial developer, or adjacent landowner may alter, pave, modify, expand, or repurpose the protected roadway without written authorization from the Carter family. Walter read it slowly, clearly, and when he finished, nobody spoke, not even the HOA attorneys, because suddenly the case became brutally simple. The road belonged to my family. The HOA paved it anyway. Then came the devastating evidence. Walter presented internal emails from the development company. Emails proving they knew ownership concerns existed before construction started. One message specifically warned, road ownership unresolved. Recommend legal clarification before paving. But they paved it anyway. Another email discussed potential litigation risk. Another referenced accelerating construction timelines before access complications emerge. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Because now this wasn't just a misunderstanding. This wasn't an accident. It was negligence. Possibly intentional negligence. I looked over at Richard Holloway during that moment. And honestly, he looked sick. Like a man realizing his entire future might be collapsing in real time. The judge looked furious. Actually furious. And things only got worse from there. Walter introduced drone footage recorded shortly after construction started. Fresh footage showing crews tearing through marked property boundaries. Fence lines destroyed. Survey markers ignored. Heavy machinery paving directly across protected land. At one point, the judge paused the footage and asked, were these workers informed ownership was disputed? One contractor reluctantly admitted yes. That answer hit the courtroom like a bomb, because it proved construction continued despite active legal uncertainty. The HOA attorneys immediately started scrambling, interrupting, objecting, trying to redirect blame. But the damage